Nationalism and Revolution unit, we're going to focus on another part of Europe. So we've talked about France, we've talked about the multi-ethnic empires in the eastern part of Europe, and so now we're going to come back to the western part, and a lot of important things are happening during this time period in places like Britain, Italy, and Germany. And really, nationalism here does not have the effect of breaking up or weakening countries, but actually strengthens countries. And it leads in Great Britain, it leads to reforms of the government. And essentially it leads to greater democratic control instead of the monarchy having as much control as it once did. And so during this period of the 19th century, so the 1800s, in the 1830s and 1848, like those 2 years of revolutions where countries were revolting, the British weren't revolting, but they were protesting. They were pushing to have, the ordinary people were pushing to have a greater say in how their country was run. And so from pressure from the people, eventually the monarchy kind of loosens up a bit, and it gives the House of Commons, which is the parliament, and the popularly elected part of parliament, more influence. So just like in America, how we have two houses of Congress, we have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. Great Britain also had that. They had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords or the people in the House of Lords are picked by the king or the queen, and they are usually nobility, right? They have noble titles. Their families have long histories in Great Britain. The House of Commons was the more ordinary people, the middle class and working class people, and that's where they were represented. And a really key reform that occurs that really helps to give ordinary people more power is the secret ballot. And so this essentially is when you cast a vote, it's done in secret and no one knows who voted for who. And this is good because it eliminates a lot of pressure people felt from, external pressures when election time came, right? If it was clear, if people knew who voted for who, you could easily bribe them or tempt them or coerce them into changing their vote. And so secret ballot gives it more autonomy, and it makes it more anonymous and allows people to actually vote for what they want. And when they elect representatives that represent really their interests, then things start to change in the House of Commons. It's just how in this system emerges in Great Britain a parliamentary democracy, which is a democracy run under the parliament system, which I just mentioned, right? The House of Commons, House of Lords, the party that is in charge in the parliament, the majority party, picks someone in that party to become the prime minister. And they're not like a president because they actually sit in and vote in the parliament, whereas the president of the United States doesn't vote in Congress, right? But the prime minister is a member of the parliament, but he's considered the first among equals, right? So he's the leader of the party, therefore the leader of the country, but he has a voting power in parliament. So if we go back to the idea of the Enlightenment and this idea of separation of powers, here we actually do not have a separation of the executive and the legislative powers. They're merged in one with the parliament and the prime minister. And as the 19th century progresses, the monarch becomes weaker and weaker. And today there is still a monarchy in Britain, right? There's Queen Elizabeth II, but she has no real formal power. She has lots of influence and things like that, but not real formal power. And this kind of begins to happen during this time period, the 1830s, 1848, right, when these reforms are starting to be made. Another important change that happens is that the electorate, those people who are eligible to vote in Great Britain, increases during this time. With acts of parliament and the approval of the monarchy, more people are now considered eligible to vote. And when more people are eligible to vote, it becomes more democratic, right? Because now more ordinary people. At one point it might have been property-owning people, now it's just anybody, right? Eventually they lower the voting age, right, from 25, I think, down to 18. And so things like that increase the number of people participating in the democracy, or at least the number of those who could participate in the democracy. And there's one other reform that's made, and it's reform to what they called rotten boroughs. And so in Great Britain at this time, the different boroughs were almost like the districts, right? So each borough had a representative, say. And there was many boroughs where there was the person in charge, right, was either not present in that borough, so they were like a lord or a noble, or the boroughs were designed in a way to give more power to a certain group of people, right? We kind of have something like that today in our own politics. We call it gerrymandering, and when we change district lines to kind of fit a certain idea or a certain group. And so a lot of these rotten boroughs are kind of eliminated and made so that it's more fair, that the people living there have a greater say in what's happening. So all those reforms in Britain make it more democratic. And again, that is connected to nationalism, right? Because the British had this proud history of having a parliament, first of all, that had more power than places like France and so on, right? They went through their revolution in Britain earlier, right, in the 1680s with King Charles and Oliver Cromwell, right? So they kind of have a sense of pride in that and having this long democratic tradition, even dating back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And so that proud tradition of democracy that they believe they have kind of helps them rally around and promote these greater democratic reforms. But the issue of nationalism is going to challenge Great Britain, because Great Britain at this time is an empire that controls more than just the English people. So, for example, directly at home, they have the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish, and then they also control parts of India, and they'll control parts of Africa. So this idea of nationalism is going to challenge British power. And the closest to home that it does this is in Ireland. So Ireland, since it was conquered during the days of Cromwell and even earlier, the Irish have resisted British occupation throughout their entire history. And during this time period, as nationalism is kind of sweeping the continent and sweeping the world, the Irish kind of rise up again, and there's several different revolutions and attempted revolutions in the 1800s. And in particular, some of the Irish were represented in Parliament in Britain, but everything that happened in Ireland was a direct result of what Parliament decided. So they had no autonomy at all. It was all based on what the British wanted. And some of the Irish representatives in Parliament were trying to change this. And the famous leader that kind of promoted this idea of what they called home rule was a man named Charles Stewart Parnell, who was an Irish politician in the Parliament in Great Britain, and he advocated for home rule. Home rule was not necessarily independence from Great Britain, but more letting the Irish form their own parliament to make decisions that directly affect them. Right? So instead of having every little thing that had to happen in Ireland being decided by the British in London, people like Parnell were advocating for this idea of home rule, where things that applied directly to the Irish could be decided among the Irish themselves. This movement is largely unsuccessful. There's going to be more revolutions and civil wars. It's actually not until 1921 where Irish independence is finally achieved. So not until after World War I and after a Irish Civil War that the Irish gain their own independence. But this is another example of a multi-ethnic empire, Great Britain this time, being challenged by this nationalist identity. This time period also has the effect of helping groups of people, these different nations or ethnicities, unifying. And the two most famous examples of that are Germany and Italy. So to us, a lot of people in the class might be German or might be Italian, so you kind of just assume that's your heritage, right? But for most of history, there was no such thing as a united Germany or no such thing as a united Italy. There were different groups in each part. In Germany, there's lots of different German-speaking kingdoms. Other people like the French or the Austrians would take control of parts of Germany and Italy. And even in Italy, right, even to this day, there's a noticeable difference between Southern Italian culture and Northern Italian culture, right? So they were never formally united until this time period, until the 19th century. And actually for both of these countries, they form as a united Italy and united Germany in the year 1870. And so a really key figure of the unification movement in Germany is a man named Otto von Bismarck. And he's an important name to know because not only does he affect this, but he plays a role in Germany moving forward as well into World War I. So Otto von Bismarck uses a policy of what's called realpolitik, which is, I guess, a German word. And that means he was not necessarily attached to any one ideology or belief system, but in realpolitik, you're being pragmatic, right? You do what's going to best promote the interests of uniting Germany. And so that's kind of a term that we should associate with Otto von Bismarck, the idea of realpolitik. Otto von Bismarck was a Prussian, and he was not the king, but he was a very influential government leader who helped the King of Prussia unite all of Germany into what they called the Second Reich. Reich is a kingdom, so the Second Kingdom. The First Kingdom, the last time that Germany was united, would have been under the Holy Roman Empire in medieval history. The word Reich might sound familiar because the next time it's used is under Hitler in the Third Reich, right? So that's kind of the origins of why Hitler is the Third Reich. This is the second one. He had a Second Kingdom. The Germans had a couple things going for them, right? They had a common language and they had common culture to help them unite. What they did not have in common, though, was a common religion. Northern Germany, the northern German states, like Prussia, for example, were Protestant, and the southern German kingdoms, like Bavaria, which is where Munich is, were Catholic. And so that was a major stumbling block for German unification after all these years. But Bismarck orchestrates a war against France known as the Franco-Prussian War, which the Germans win, the Prussians win, and it kind of rallies all German-speaking people around the pride of being German and that the German people had conquered this territory. All right, and so really after this moment of the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans win, that's when we kind of see a united Germany where all these different German states were working under the Prussian government. In Italy, there's a couple different leaders, some in the south, some in the north, and they are Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi, and also a man named Camillo Cavour. And these three figures helped to unite all the different kingdoms of France. So, for example, Sicily and Naples was one kingdom. There was the Papal States, which were the territories surrounding Rome, which was directly controlled by the Pope. And you have kingdoms up in the north as well. And they helped to unite after years of revolution and fighting and all this stuff. They united under one king, a man named Victor Emmanuel. And again, this happens by the year 1870. They're united. The Italians have a shared language, culture, and religion, right? They kind of all these similarities help them unite. Really, what a major stumbling block was for the Italian unification was the Papal States, right? At this time, even up to this point, the Pope was more than just a religious leader. He was also a political leader. And everything in orange here on the left-hand side was what he controlled. And he did not want to lose that territory, the Pope at this time. And so that was the major stumbling block. Once that finally is conquered and the Pope is kind of agrees with, ceding it and surrenders essentially, Italy is not going to stay. That's when Italy unites. And today, the final agreement, the compromise, so to speak, was that in Rome itself, there's a place called the Vatican. And the Vatican's actually technically an independent country where the Pope is the head of that country. So it's a small neighborhood in the city of Rome, really, right? And that's was once the capital of all these papal states, but now that's all it is. And even today in Italy, there's the Vatican. There's a place called San Marino as well, which is also a tiny independent city-state. So technically, there was still parts of Italy that did not successfully unite under one. But overall, Italy forms with the help of Garibaldi, Mazzini, Cavour, and under the rule of a man named Victor Emmanuel. And this happens in 1870. The map on the right-hand side here just shows you where Prussia is, right? Prussia was in northeastern Germany, and they are able to eventually unite the gray shaded area there, the rest of the northern part of the territory, by 1867. And then the southern part, down by Bavaria and Munich, right, that was the Catholic part that had kind of greater attachments to Austria at the time, and they become eventually part as well by 1871. Also in 1871, the land between France and Germany, right, the Germans gained more territory, that placed Lorraine and Strasbourg here in Alsace. And Alsace-Lorraine is going to be important for World War... So the territory of Alsace-Lorraine will become very important in our conversations about World War I and World War II. So we're kind of laying the groundwork here for some of these major conflicts coming up. So in addition to challenging some nations like the multi-ethnic empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, we see here nationalism actually strengthening countries by bringing people together, right? By bringing the Germans together and by bringing the Italians together. So we see nationalism doing different things in different contexts.